I may not be the biggest Devil May Cry expert, in fact I've only played part of DMC4 before, but I know what I like, and generally speaking, I love myself a good character action game. Bayonetta 1 and 2, Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, all absolute classics in my eyes. And I'd be lying if I said my hands weren't getting itchy with every Devil May Cry 5 trailer that dropped. So now that it's out, are fans set to cry tears of joy or just normal tears? Set 5 years after the events of DMC4, Devil May Cry 5 follows returning heroes Nero and Dante, as well as edgelord newcomer V, as they take on yet another demonic threat to the Earth. Questions abound with regards to the identity of this powerful threat, why it tore Nero's demon arm from him, and what its connection is to the mysterious V. And after a disastrous first attempt at taking the demon down, it's time for the heroes to climb their way back up to it for round 2. Climbing towers to defeat demons is hardly the most original setup for a narrative, but DMC5 does a good job of making it interesting with the inclusion of these little mysteries to solve along the way. Unfortunately, the most engaging questions are answered about halfway through, leaving the game's story hanging on its characters more than its plot. Thankfully, Dante is as charmingly goofy as ever, and Nero, though significantly less charming than his demon-hunting peer, still brings a lot of heart to the story. The only character I was never fully sold on was V. He's so cringe-inducingly awkward, and so much of his character hinges on the core intrigue of the plot that I found it hard to separate him as a character from the lackluster plot reveals. In terms of gameplay, on the other hand, I found myself pulled in by the mechanics and styles of each character in their own way. It's rare to have a game that lets you play as multiple characters that are so distinct, and DMC5 does it superbly, but it's all built off of solid mechanics shared across all three. As with all good character action games, executing attacks is responsive, and you're given a solid amount of combo strings and techniques to work with in order to take down enemies with different strengths, or simply build up your style meter. The game requires a decent amount of precision to pull off some of the moves on offer, and enemies on the standard difficulty are no slouches, so if you're like me, that is to say familiar but not an expert, then you're in for a good challenge. I will say that my only complaint with the game's core mechanics is that the lock-on switch wasn't as responsive as I'd have liked. There were a handful of situations where it simply wouldn't work for me, forcing me to let go of the lock-on entirely before trying to manually retarget an enemy. But I digress. For the most part, DMC5 is super slick to control at its core, but with the addition of 3 characters to play as, the game basically offers 3 unique experiences. First up is Nero, who uses a variety of equipable prosthetic arms known as Devil Breakers, and these augment his combat abilities as well as acting as a grapple arm for bringing long-range threats in close. These Devil Breakers are fragile and can be destroyed by using their charge attacks, by being hit mid-Devil Breaker attack, or by simply detonating them to buy yourself some breathing room, making for a bit of a risk-reward trade-off. Their functions range from stopping time in small areas, to blasting enemies with electricity, to whipping them with fast strikes, and there's enough variety between them that I often found myself wishing that the game would let me swap between them on the fly, if only to test them out without destroying them. Next up is Dante, whose gameplay features multiple long and close-range weapons, as well as fighting styles that modify them to some degree. In terms of weapons, you start with a pretty standard longsword, as well as some gauntlets and boots that let you pull off boxing strikes and kick combos, and even in this early stage, Dante's sections offer a decent amount of variety. You get access to Dante's Trickster, Royal Guard, Swordmaster, and Gunslinger styles, which add mobility options, parries, extra melee options, and unique gun attacks on top of his already packed moveset. And again, this is only in Dante's first stage. Later on you gain access to other new weapons which add more and more to your already extensive repertoire, and I think it's worth noting that the game never becomes overwhelming with all of these options. DMC5 waits a decent amount of time before giving you more weapons, and the combos are fairly universal, so even though each weapon will have its own quirks, you'll quickly figure out how to best implement them. Lastly is V, and like his place in the story, he's the black sheep of the mechanical department as well. That's not to say that he feels bad to use, it's more that he's a significant departure to Nero or Dante, whose styles I would consider more or less a base structure of Devil May Cry combat. Instead of getting up in enemies' faces and pulling off sick weapon combos, V instead hangs back in the fight. He can't personally dish out as much damage as Nero or Dante, and he certainly seems to take more damage than them too. Instead, V sends out demons to do his dirty work for him, before snapping to a weakened enemy to land the finishing blow. Using V's demonic eagle and panther to land ranged and melee attacks respectively feels weird at first, especially since it adds another 2 health meters to keep an eye on, and keeping an eye on these and the characters themselves can be a little bit overwhelming initially. But before long you're raining lightning down on your enemies with the eagle, and popping enemies up and performing air combos with the panther, all while dodging and double jumping to warp them back to your side in case of danger. It really is just a matter of learning how to recall your summons and how exactly their moves work before V feels as natural as the other two characters. Of course, if things get too hectic, you can always use Devil Trigger. Only V and Dante have access to this form, with Nero getting to blow up his Devil Breaker if he gets in over his head, though both characters' trigger forms act differently. While Dante's meter serves as a more traditional rage mechanic, increasing strength and recovering health once used, V's summons a massive golem to decimate the opposition, but both are incredibly satisfying to use effectively. They're also pretty easy to build back up, so you never feel discouraged in using Devil Trigger as often as you want. And you should probably use every advantage you get, because the game can be pretty difficult at times. Thankfully, DMC5 brings back the gold orbs found in previous games, allowing on-the-spot revival at a cost to your overall style ranking, and instead of requiring some kind of orb to revive at a checkpoint, the game simply allows it. Presumably this comes with its own style cost, but having only died a handful of times, and only reviving on the spot once or twice, I can't honestly say. What I can honestly say is that Devil May Cry 5's soundtrack is an absolute banger. The game comes alive during combat as metal and synth tracks pump their way into your ears, and there's nothing cooler than hearing each character's signature track become louder and more layered with each level of style you achieve. As soon as you hear the lyrics to Devil Trigger kick in, you know you're doing something right. It certainly helps that each sword strike and gunshot sounds loud and impactful, but none of what makes DMC5's combat so enjoyable would be half as effective without the game's visual effects and overall crisp, clean look. Despite the amount that can be happening on screen at any given time, it's rare that anything actually gets lost in the action. Every successful sword strike lands with a clear and satisfying shine spark, and finishing a combat sequence with a slow motion zoom is a stroke of brilliance. It'd be crazy of me to not also mention DMC5's animation, which is detailed and smooth despite its need to be quick and responsive. And the game features some truly fantastic enemy designs, running the gamut from gross and weird to downright creepy. It's a shame then that these fantastic visual elements are utilized in such boring environments. I mean, it isn't all bad, I guess. For about half of the game you're exploring these ruined cityscapes where hell itself is seeping through the ground, and the twisted geometry and husks of buildings look super cool, but once you leave this setting it's all jagged, gooey demon tree levels as far as the eye can see. Now, it is what it is. When you set your game predominantly in one location, it's bound to get old after a while, but even with that in mind, DMC5's hellish landscapes aren't the most inspired you could find in the world of video games. But honestly, that's probably my biggest frustration with the game. Devil May Cry 5's levels, especially in the latter half, are pretty boring. And as far as criticisms go, I'd say that's pretty tame. I could also say that the platforming sections feel a bit stiff and not particularly fun, or that the inclusion of microtransactions is as gross as it usually is, but these are all such minor nitpicks. The platforming that the game has to offer is sparse at best, so you don't really have to put up with it that much. And the microtransactions, while gross, are such non-entities that it's almost not even worth mentioning. I mean, you can buy red orbs, but the game practically throws them at you anyway, so why would you even bother? On top of large amounts of red orbs, DMC5 also gives you multiple difficulty levels upon hitting the credits, which are honestly pretty different, going so far as to add late game enemies into as early as the first level of the game. As well as more challenge, DMC5 also adds a neat little flourish to each boss and enemy entry in your gallery, attaching a fun snapshot of each enemy's moment of death when you next beat them. It isn't massive, but there is something very cute about it, and it gives players a reason to hunt down all the game's enemies again. There are also some secret missions which take a little bit more effort to find and complete if you're into that sort of challenge mission thing, as well as a weird multiplayer element which is also kinda cool, but doesn't offer much in terms of replayability. Basically, it works a little like Journey. As you play through the campaign, you'll sometimes be matched up with other players experiencing concurrent sections of the story as other characters. And on rare occasions, you might see them in the background, or rarer still, you might team up to take on a fight. Like I said, it's kinda cool, but it rarely adds much to the experience. So, with all that said, Devil May Cry 5 is excellent. It's a pulse-pounding adrenaline rush from start to finish, and once you wrap your head around each of the characters, every battle turns into a dance floor for you to show off your moves. The story may not keep up the same level of intrigue for its entirety, but the cast of fun characters keeps it chugging along, and although the scenery can get a bit boring, the gameplay did more than enough to reel my attention back in whenever I'd start to drift. DMC5 is definitely worth checking out whether you're an old fan or a newcomer to the series.